All right. So hopefully your environment's all set up and you've run it and you might be failing test cases, but how do we fix this? Well, it's insanely simple once you get the concept down and you remember the details in Python. So the name, the rank, the color, the active, everything else is actually just simply looking at these variables that I set up for the object. So when I'm returning the name here, I'm just simply returning the name. And I'm returning the rank, I'm simply returning the rank. When I'm returning the color, I'm simply returning the color. And I'm returning active, I'm returning simply active here. So the idea of a getter, and we'll see later on setters, is just simply returning the results of a existing variable that is an attribute of the class, or changing the value of an existing variable which is an attribute of the class. This idea of having getters and setters is a notion called encapsulation. And so it allows me to hide the variable's real name and to control how you get it or how you return it. So I could, for example, keep the name as all capitals, or I could, save the name by breaking up into first name and last name, or something like that. Um, there's all sorts of ways I could store it internally that doesn't need to be the way you see it. And this allows me to do that later on. For the most part, though, I'm just returning a value. Now, mind you, I'm lying to you a little bit. This code will not work, but I want to show you what goes wrong if you do it wrong. Now, I hit F5 right there, and it ran the code, and nothing happened. Why? Well, because I didn't actually run the test code. Remember, we're dealing with multiple files here as now that we're messing with classes. So if I come back over to test piece and run that, oh, well, there's actually an error inside of there. Why, when I ran this, wasn't there an error? It all came back as fine. Well, when I ran this, it didn't actually run any code. It didn't actually execute any of these getter methods that I created. It wasn't until I came over here and ran the test case, you can see on piece line 9. Well, if I go and turn on my code, oops, line numbers. Line 9, it doesn't like name. Return name. Name is not defined. Well, why isn't name defined? I mean, should I just say name is equal to something? I hit F5 there, it saves it, but I come over here and actually want to run it. It's like, oh well, okay, so that one worked, but rank is not defined. I could continue to do that, but that's not the right answer. You might have picked up it right away. Why is it self.name here and name up here? Here is name, but not self.name. So what's the difference between name and self.name? Well, down here, I can use name because I passed in the parameters name, rank, and color, as well as self. Up here, I'm only passing in self. I don't have name defined. When I put this line of code, I define name out there. So what I need to do here is self.name. So when I do self.name, it's getting the variable that I set up down here. Now, the Python has a little bit, I'm actually going to call it a screwy notion because I don't like it too much. But Python requires you to pass in the object you're working with. It's often called self. It doesn't necessarily have to be called self, but the first parameter in a class is the object you're working with. And that's great because then I have the thing I'm working on every time. In C, in Java, in JavaScript, the variable self is named this, THIS, this. Um, but again, the Python convention is self. So think of it this way. I want you to compare your resume with another person's resume. Well, you have a copy of your own resume, assuming you've built one. You can go and get that for yourself. Python makes it really explicit and says, here is you. You go ahead and do your resume. So it's not necessarily the worst to have the self variable here, but it is also required. If you don't put it here, your code actually won't compile properly. So you'll experience that more later on in some of the other exercises. But I just want to point out what this self variable is, what it means. So I believe now I might have fixed it, name, rank, everything else. So I'm going to go over here and run my test. Let me get that out of the way, and I run my test. Oh, rank is not defined. Isn't that the error I got last time? Well, it actually is entirely. Remember, this does not save automatically. You can see the star next to piece. I need to Control S save that, or File save that, however you prefer to do that, or run it, and which won't do anything, but it will save it. And then when I run it again, notice now I have a bunch of errors, but the errors are all on attack. So I've seemed to have set up my class properly, where I have my get name, get rank, get color, get active, and now it's just a matter of figuring out whether or not the attack logic works, which we'll take on next. But I want you to have this idea of the self object. The self object must be passed in, to must be a parameter in every method that a class has. So it's inside a piece here, so it has to be there. But it's what I use to access the data shared across everything. A individual variable, like we'll see in a second with other piece, is changes every single time. But self is kind of like my long-term memories. It's what I keep track of. It's what I remember. So you might not remember the author who wrote our book, but you will remember rules about Python, years and years to come. That's an analogy, not perfect, but if that makes sense a little bit. There's what you're working with right now versus what you're going to keep forever, and hopefully Python's one of those things. So go ahead and play with this. Make sure this is all working. Get to the point of having the attack errors, and then we'll pick that up in the next video here.